This is your Kick-Ass Life podcast, episode number 186 with guest Sasha Tozzi.
This is the Your Kick-Ass Life podcast with Andrea Owen, a no BS guide to self-help and badassery. Because ladies, let's face it, life's too short for it to not kick ass. And here's your host, the girl who serves it up straight with a side of crazy, Andrea Owen.
All right. Happy day, everyone. Welcome to another recovery episode. This is our third recovery episode in this particular series. If you didn't know, there is an additional 10 recovery episodes from last year. I figured I might want to mention that for some of you who are new to the podcast or found out about this recovery section of my regular podcast. I did a whole 10 episodes last year. That link is in the show notes. You know what I was thinking too? I mention the show notes, like, capital T, capital S, capital N. Like it's this thing that everybody knows how to get there. I feel like sometimes it's not that straightforward in whatever app you're using to listen to your podcasts. Maybe many of you are like, of course I know how to get to it, but there might be some of you who have trouble. That would be me. So if you also go to yourkickasslife.com/ and then the number of the podcast episode, that's always where the show notes will be. So this one is yourkickasslife.com /186. All of the links are there for anything that I'm talking about here and that Sasha and I will be talking about. And this goes for any podcast episode that I do. This particular episode will have a lot of links because I got a lot of things to tell you. Before we get into the conversation I have with Sasha, I wanted to let you know that we are still in the pre-order phase of this book party. My new book, How to Stop Feeling Like Shit, 14 Habits That Are Holding You Back from Happiness, which by the way, I was talking to, now I totally forget who it was, about recovery, and she read the book and she was like, this is a book about recovery. And I'm like, I guess it is a book about recovery. It really is. So those of you who are new in your recovery, or even if you're not in recovery, this book is for you. I would love for you to do two things. Please pre-order the book. I've gone on and on about how important pre-orders are for any author, myself included. Those numbers really are important to us. I'll talk about that at a later date. I actually have a podcast episode coming out in February where I'm going to talk about how I went down the rabbit hole of not feeling good enough because of something. Again, I'll talk about that more in an episode in a few weeks. So first thing I would love for you to do is please pre-order the book. Second thing is to sign up for my free book club. I'm offering a free group study for anyone that orders the book either now or in the beginning of January. Again, those links are in the show notes, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you it's at yourkickasslife.com /HTSFLS, which is the acronym for the book, How to Stop Feeling Like Shit. Also, I'm probably coming to a city near you. So again, in those show notes for all of the links, come and see me so we can squeal, or I will squeal, and I can sign your book and answer your questions and take lots of pictures. And also there are a few spots left. I'm doing 2 workshops, one in New York City and one in Chicago. I'm keeping these really small and intimate, 3 hours of workshopping with me and other awesome women. And also, last thing, some of you have asked me along the way, and this is over the last, I've been podcasting now for, I don't know, I think I started in 2013 or 2014. It was when I was writing my first book. And I was back then, it was like kind of haphazardly, like I think I put out an episode every other week for a while. And then it, kind of gained traction. We have over 1 million downloads. I know that most podcasters, it's like, that's a big celebration and they do this big party and everything. And oh my gosh, I didn't do that. We hit 1 million downloads in October. Oh man, I know I should probably be better at that, but I was dealing with other things. But a lot of you along the way have asked me, your podcast has helped me so much. Can I donate to the podcast? Can I somehow pay you back for all of the help that you have done for me? And I've always said no, and I've never set that up. Some podcasters do. Patreon or something. I don't even know what that is. And I've always said no, but what you can do is buy the book. And it would be even more awesome if you shared it with your friends. It's $11.59 on Amazon. And people have also been asking me if it matters what link they use to buy it. If they go to, target.com or amazon.com, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And also want to say one more thing. Australia. I know I have a lot of Australian listeners. Black Ink Publishing is publishing my book. So you don't have to come all the way over here to buy it. I bet you would do that. But there's a link in the show notes that directly sends you to that Australian publisher so you can order it over there. Again, lots of links in the show notes. Thank you so much for supporting Your Kick-Ass Life and supporting me along this journey. I cannot wait to share this book with you. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited for you to read it. I put my heart and soul into it. This is definitely a step up from my first book. And this really came from just listening to the universe and listening to you all about what you needed and really paying attention to your stories and your feelings and what tools and strategies you needed to live your biggest life, to live your kick-ass life. So again, can't wait for you to read it. That being said, let me tell you a little bit about Sasha before we jump in. Sasha is a writer, life and recovery coach, speaker, and woman who believes in hope, healing, and daily miracles. She loves the ocean, namasteing sober, and the lion is her spirit animal. Without further ado, here is Sasha. Hi, Sasha. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Andrea. Thank you so much for having me.
I am so glad to have this conversation because I know that with your story, it's not just about alcohol. There's like several different addictions and things that you have struggled with in the past. And so I'm really pumped to jump in and get started. So why don't we start there? So can you give us a little background of your story? When did you quit drinking? And, I think I'm really curious about, because you said that you struggled with food and love and relationships. And so was it like, did you quit everything all at once?
Oh, no.
Was it like one thing at a time? What was sort of the timeline of everything?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so basically, I did not quit everything at once. That would have been so excruciatingly hard. So I quit drinking alcohol and using drugs 6 years ago this month. I just celebrated last weekend, September 2nd. And at that time, this was 2011, and I was really just quitting to primarily by default. I wanted to get out of the pain I was causing myself, and I had a lot of shame about what I was doing because I was the kind of drinker that I was a binge drinker, all or nothing, and I totally blacked out almost every time I drank. So I was causing I was very reckless and causing a lot of pain to myself and to other people. Just kind of, I would have personality changes and just drinking and driving and sleeping around and really, getting myself into so many precarious situations that I'm shocked that I made it. Mm-hmm. So when I quit, I needed to change something, and I decided to try that. And I wasn't planning on staying quit. Like, I was just like, I'm going to try this. This is an experiment. I'm just going to detox. Mm-hmm. I'm going to detox for a couple of months. 3 months after I quit drinking, I quit smoking cigarettes. I was a big smoker, which was very incongruent with my image. I was sort of this good girl, and I was into exercise, but I was smoking a pack a day. Mm-hmm. And so I quit. That was a big quit because I relied on cigarettes for everything. It was sort of like my security blanket. So I quit that in December of 2011 and got rid of that crutch or something. I heard Brad Pitt, because he's recently sober, I heard him call these things pacifiers. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of funny when you think of that, like a child has the passy. I quit those in December. And then, as time went on, more things would come to my attention. So I think of denial as this process that is very protective. Like we use denial for it's useful until it isn't. And so things would come to my attention that I hadn't been ready to see prior to that. And it was sort of like one by one that they would come.
So like what? Can you give us an example of things that were coming into your attention?
So I'm saying the other addictions and things, the food, the body image, the men and codependency, those were all issues that came sort of after I was sober enough to deal with it or look at it, because the drinking was hiding the other underlying issues for me. And my underlying issues were like, so the drinking and the cigarettes and the acting out, all of that. I then had this food, like an eating disorder essentially, where I was stuck in a cycle of like binging and restricting. And along with that, I had this codependency as well that usually codependency. So just for clarification, just really being sort of obsessed with other people. But this especially showed up with men and my love relationships. So that was coming to the surface for me as the longer I stayed sober, and these other issues. It was like, I've heard it been called whack-a-mole. Totally. Where like get rid of one thing and then something else comes up and you get rid of that and something else comes up and it's like, oh my God, is this ever going to end? And so that's sort of what happened. I just, in retrospect, as it was happening, I felt like so damaged, like, why do I have all of these problems type of thing?
Yeah. Why am I so broken?
Right. And just sort of like, I can't handle anything else. Like, I don't want to look anymore. But in retrospect, obviously, I am so glad that I did, because every time that I really addressed what was in my space to address, I got more freedom and more like just a greater sense of well-being from doing that.
Let me stop you for a second. So it sounds like you realized that your drinking was out of control and hurting you and others, and then you decided to do the experiment to quit for a couple months. So is it that when you kind of got some clarity and then realized that you had a problem with food and love and relationships and codependence? Like roughly, not like, perfectly.
Roughly. I mean, those things have been problems before.
Sure.
But I wasn't like equipped or ready or willing to really deal with it.
Well, the reason I ask is that's interesting, because I think that that's common for a lot of people. Mine was actually the opposite. So I don't know if I've ever mentioned this on the recovery series or anywhere. I had been in therapy for a long time before, and worked on like the regular things that people work on in therapy, family stuff and anxiety and things like that. And then my therapist had mentioned codependency, but I think I was still kind of like in denial. I was like, no. This is my ex. I was married to someone else before, and I was like, this is all his problem. Like, he needs to fix himself, and then he and I will be better. So that relationship ended. And then I was in another terrible relationship. And that particular person I was with went to rehab, and I went for like family week. It's so serendipitous. And we're having like these group therapy things, and it was for him, right? But then I'm like, and then he's like talking about all this stuff that he's realizing about himself. And then I was like, holy shit, I'm a love addict. And I need to admit that I'm a codependent, because from what I understand, like all love addicts are codependents. Not all codependents are love addicts, but all love addicts are codependents. So I started working on that pretty diligently, and also my eating disorder all at the same time. But it wasn't until, 2007, 4 years later, that I got sober. Because it was like that stuff that allowed me to like have the self-awareness, like of all the kind of triggers and just stuff that comes up. And too, for me, I don't know if it was this way for you. When I quit all that other stuff, the love addiction, the codependence, the eating disorder, my drinking picked up speed. It almost like it took its place. It's like, okay, so if I can't do that, have all those behaviors, then I'm just going to drink more.
Yeah, that's so fascinating to me, because it was sort of opposite for me, but the drinking drove a lot of those behaviors to be amplified for me. Like my drug use, like I was really into uppers. Drinking sort of made me gave me this euphoric feeling and sort of made me hypersexual. So it like enabled me to act in the ways that, like, I don't think I could have done it the other way around like you did it. And I think that's amazing that everybody can have such a different story, but we end up in more or less the same place.
It's the same path. It just looks different and people are on different places of it, I feel like.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm really also interested in what your love addiction looked like, because that isn't something we're going to have another guest on here and talk about it, but I don't think it gets talked about a lot. And I do have listeners who, when I mention it on my podcast, who write to me and they're like, oh my God, I think I'm a love addict. So can you talk about what that looked like in your life? Whether you identify as a love addict or not, I'm just using that as a reference point. What did that addiction look like for you?
Oh, sure. I definitely identify as a love addict, and I see the overlap with the codependency. And I like what you said about not all codependents are love addicts, but all love addicts are codependents. So I've had a really complicated sort of original situation with relating to men, as most of us do. I have the daddy issues. And so I came from a place of making men, this is what I consider to be like the picture of my love addiction, making men, and especially the ones I was into, my higher power and my putting them on a pedestal. And if they were higher, then I was lower. And so we weren't equal, and everything, it was all about them.
Right.
It was all about them. And I would do anything for male attention and male affection. And I was obsessed with it. And it was a compulsion. And I remember drinking, using drinking almost as an excuse to act like that. And when I would be drunk, I would be like, I never had fun in the sense that I could like go out with my girlfriends and just hang out with them. It was always about a guy and trying to get some guy's attention and trying to
some kind of hookup. Yeah.
That was it was like I went in with a goal, and if I didn't make that goal happen, I was upset and depressed. And so I got into a relationship before I got sober, I met a guy. We were both had addictive tendencies, and we both kind of became addicted to each other. And I would say, storm. It was. I would say we were both love addicts, and it was a highly codependent relationship where we were like attached at the hip and could not, just totally obsessed with each other, but not in the good way, or if there is a good way, I'm not sure, but and so that was eye-opening to me. I didn't know love to be something other than being really attached to someone. I didn't know that like when you love someone, you're supposed to feel free to be who you are, and like they're free to be who they are. And it's sort of this whole Al-Anon idea of like live and let live. And I didn't know that. I was totally the opposite. I was like, if you love someone, you smother them.
Your life revolves around that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what love is.
Right. It's total enmeshment.
Yes.
Their problems are your problems, and there's no boundaries, and there's no, there was no like separation of like how I felt and how he felt. It was my mood and my feelings were dependent on him.
There's no autonomy.
No autonomy. Exactly. That's more or less what it looks like in a relationship. And even when I was in a relationship, it was always about finding that. And I can easily transfer that onto other people that aren't men and not romantic relationships, which is why I consider myself codependent as well as just a basic love addict, because it's kind of like it can apply to, I try not to pedestal anyone, like friends, coworkers, clients, even people that are doing really awesome stuff that I like somewhat idolize. I still try not to make them out to be like not human.
Right. That's interesting. And mine looked a lot like that as well. And it's what's really, I think, just kind of mind blowing is that it is sort of like that, like fish being in water and they don't realize like what they're actually in. And I'm the same. And what's also kind of, in retrospect for me, when I look back, and a lot of times people fall into addictions because that's what was modeled for them from their family of origin. That was not the case with me. My parents, from what I witnessed and sensed, had a healthy married relationship, and they did end up getting divorced right when I graduated high school, which kind of pulled the rug out from under me and was its own set of problems because it was never addressed or talked about. But I mean, my love addiction and codependency started when I was in high school. It was almost as if that, because everybody remembers like teenage love. Remember that? Like when you're like 15, 16 and you're just like obsessed with that person. And I think for most people that sort of wears off and you become more of an adult and you become healthier in your boundaries and things like that. So for me, that never wore off. Like
me either.
I just was like that all the time and just thought that's what love meant. And no, I'm with you. It was for me, I don't know if you were this way too, but because I was in a relationship from the time I was 17 until I was 31. And he and I were, oh God, I'll write a memoir about it. I've talked about it on the podcast. It was a tumultuous, unhealthy roller coaster of a relationship that went on for a long time. But we both cheated on each other. And I cheated because for several reasons. One of them being was that I was a straight up and down love addict. And I would go out with my girlfriends, and it was consciously, I thought it was because I was getting back at him because I knew he was doing it to me and I needed to, I deserved this. But unconsciously it was because for me, it was a cycle. I couldn't tolerate who I was as a person and the place I was in my relationship with him. So I would go out and try to get validation and attention and quote unquote love from other men. And then I would get it and then feel good for like an hour or two. And then the next morning feel like such shit about myself. And then the whole cycle would start over. So it's similar with drinking. It's like that whole, let me just numb this out and feel good for like a couple of hours so I don't have to think about all the other shit in my life that's consuming me. And then that buzz wears off. And it's almost as like for me, it was like I hit the ground face down and was like, oh my God, what have I done? And then trying to justify the behavior. Then the whole thing would start over again. And then I would feel so guilty for doing it. So I would try harder to be a better girlfriend in my relationship. So I would tolerate shit that he would do to me. And it was just like, when I look back at it and I'm like, wow, that was a disaster. But I didn't know, I didn't know any different. And I just thought if I kept trying harder, then it's gotta get better. It's just,
it's that self-will that's what I felt like with drinking, the exact same. If I just tried harder to control myself, then I could. So I just need to try harder. And that's it's so funny because it pops up everywhere. If that's the belief that you have, I just need to try harder. I just need to will myself. I just need to get him to do this,
Yeah, absolutely. And it's this cycle that, again, it's that denial piece too. It's like when you're in that cycle and coupled with denial, it will keep going and keep going and keep going. And it wasn't until I went to that rehab center and bought Pia Melody's book called Facing Love Addiction. And I started reading it and I was like, this is like my biography.
That's so weird. Oh my God, Andrea, I just was going to mention that book exactly, because it's funny. I wanted to mention something, especially for people listening, that I was not a typical love addict in that I was constantly in a relationship or constantly having sex. I have actually been single and celibate since I got sober. And so some people would, Pia Melody in her book, Facing Love Addiction, talks about the love addict and the love avoidant, and how they're opposite ends of the same spectrum.
Right.
So, people have called it love anorexic or whatever. And I think that in the beginning, that's what it was for me. And my challenge is that it can still be just as detrimental mentally if I'm not checking myself, and because I can be in that obsessive place in my mind and literally be living in a fantasy world thinking about some guy and not necessarily acting on it, but it's still causing me a lot of grief if I'm in that place in my head and just kind of, living under illusion, really.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's sort of similar but different with food, in that, with drinking, we can be completely abstinent from drinking and live our lives and be in recovery, and we don't need alcohol to live. But the opposite is true for food and for relationships. We still have to be in relationships and we still have to eat too. But for me, I really started my recovery in that with what I did is I think this is similar to what you were saying, is that when I really started to recover from my love addiction, I was already in a relationship with my current husband. We weren't married yet, but I was unwilling to walk away from it. But I was like, okay, so here's how I'm going to do it. I am going to boundary up like nobody's business, and, ward off any situations that could put me in temptation for flirting or, cause that's what I was used to. Like, that's how a lot of times where I would get my high from, is just these dangerous, risky flirting situations with other men. And so I just got all of that out of my life and thought that I was, on the right track. But then it was a couple of years in, really probably like around the time I got sober, was when I realized I had boundaried up so much in my relationship that we weren't making any motion. Like I wasn't letting him love me, is basically what was happening. It's because I had swung the pendulum so far the other way. And so that's been interesting. And it's been a slow progression, just learning what healthy love is, and like reading about it and going to therapy and couples counseling and slowly learning to trust myself. I think that's been a huge thing. Both are equally as scary for me personally, trusting other people with my heart and trusting myself that I can make a right decision and all of these things. So I'm not sure if any of it was like that for you.
Oh, totally. I mean, trusting yourself is the biggest thing, and learning how to receive. And that takes time.
Yeah.
That's not like, oh, I want to receive, so I'm going to receive now. Like, it's a whole process of like uncovering and recovering, and just takes time. And in the beginning, I was the same. I swung to the other side of the pendulum, and I was just like, no boys ever again. Like,
right.
I'm going to be a nun. Like, I can't, I couldn't, it was black and white like that. And it had to be that way until I started to learn, well, I'm still single, but it's not because I'm out there and I'm like trying to date, and it's not by choice, let's say. So it takes time to move towards the middle path and the middle way and the balanced way.
Okay. So let's talk about solution and recovery. And what are some of your, what is your favorite sobriety tool that you recommend to your own clients and that you use?
I think the top tool, because we've heard that sobriety, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And I think all of these addictions that we are talking about today, food, love, alcohol, sex, people, they're very isolating addictions to have. They're very shaming. So I would say that the top tool is to be in connection with another person or a group of persons, some kind of community where you feel like you belong and you're accepted as you are. And I like, whether that be with me as a coach or in a sober tribe online or in person or AA or another recovery support group or a yoga tribe, I feel like it's really important to just find a way to bond with other human beings, because that really takes you out of the isolation and it starts your path to healing.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where I think I didn't realize it until I got into recovery that I realized pretty quickly that there's a difference between sobriety and recovery, because anybody can get sober. Staying sober, I felt like, was the hard part. And it's not just about quitting drinking. Like, it really, and I think like almost every guest I've had on the recovery series has validated this, that the real work isn't the not drinking. The real work is all the emotional stuff. And that's, like you were saying, it's the connecting with other people and bonding in a healthy way, learning what that looks like. Emotional boundaries, I think, were huge for me, and noticing other people when they were stepping over emotional boundaries with me, and then having to have those hard conversations or walk away from relationships. Like, and that's just like, I don't mean to scare people, but like, that's just like a little bit of what all I felt like entailed the recovery process.
Yeah, well, it's life. It's life, and
it's adulting,
and which is hard. And, you know, it's the stuff underneath why we drink. It's not the drinking. It's never all of this stuff. You know, drinking is the surface problem. It's the symptom. And so everything that we need to really look at to recover and to live and to heal is the reasons why we did that underneath. And things like emotional sobriety, like you said, emotional boundaries, like all of that stuff, we obviously don't really know how to do if we were lost in addiction.
Yeah. I often ask the question, what is the problem that you're trying to solve through drinking or relationships? And I think that for most people, their knee-jerk reaction, a lot of times they'll say like stress and overwhelm. And I invite people to dig deeper in that, because everybody experiences stress and overwhelm. It's kind of just like the blanket response. But I want to know, you know, what's underneath that. Be specific, and just like keep asking yourself more, like what else to go further and further, kind of like 7 layers deep, and you'll find it. I think for most people, it's at the end of the day, a lot of times the root of it is shame and fear and that crippling loneliness, feeling that you are not like the others. You know, that when people find out that you really are scared or flawed or quote unquote broken, then they won't love you anymore. Like, these are the real deep fears that all of us have to some extent. And how you deal with it is really the solution. So, you know, I can't speak for you, but for me now, you know, it's like I still have those feelings every once in a while, not as crippling as I used to, but the solution to that for me used to be drinking, or, you know, rolling around the sheets in man's bed, or, you know, doing something to not have to think about that or try to get love and validation, or just numbing from those other things. But now it's about talking about those things and admitting it out loud to another trusted human being, and a lot of self-compassion.
Oh yeah. I feel the same with you there. And it always comes back to that self-compassion piece. And because I used it to self-medicate too, like I have all the shame and all those different feelings that were driving my urge to act out in whatever way I felt like it. But I talked about one time recently this year where I was so sad, and I have, you know, mental illness is part of my story. And so I had an urge to drink just because I didn't feel like feeling so sad. And I knew that it wasn't smart, and I knew all of those things, but I knew that would take me out of that feeling. Just, you know, it would be an instant fix for the moment. It would cause much more problems later on. But
you're not really thinking about that. You know, it's like to push that out of your head. Yeah.
Exactly. You just want instant relief. Yeah. And I think that's why, you know, thinking back, I used alcohol a lot because of social anxiety. Like, I just had tons of it. And I couldn't talk to guys unless I was drunk. And so this love addiction thing that I have, like, is really interesting because it doesn't exist in physical form unless I was drinking. Like, I wouldn't go up and talk to a guy. I wouldn't have sex with a guy. I wouldn't do anything unless I was under the influence. So it's really interesting. There are so many layers, and I love what you said about 7 layers deep, and really like being petulant to get to the root of someone's reasons. Like, okay, but why? Okay, but what is underneath that? And what is underneath that? And I don't know. I love this conversation.
I know. It's nice to talk about the stuff that I'm a big fan. I've always like called myself like, I'm the person that talks about this stuff. I've always been the person that wanted to talk about the stuff that nobody was talking about, but it didn't happen in my family. So I feel like now I'm making up for lost time. But it's interesting what you're saying about your symptom of love addiction, and mine wasn't like that. I would participate in those symptoms drunk, sober, or otherwise. Like it didn't matter. And I think my personality is a little bit different. I've always been mostly an extrovert, but my behaviors were riskier when I was drinking. I'd be more likely to, go home with someone I just met, more likely to not use protection, those types of behaviors when I was drinking. But if I was sober, it was the same. Like, yeah, it's just a little more awkward, maybe. Yeah. Less sweaty, but yeah, I still did it. I remember one time because I was like, this is just, and I think it's good to tell these stories because there's some of them where I am so appalled at my behavior. I have some drinking stories that I have not said on the air just because they're pretty bad, but this one involves a guy, and this is probably my most embarrassing and just a shameful story. So he was somebody who I typically whoever my best friend Shelby at the time, she was my best friend for like 20 years. She had various boyfriends throughout the time we were friends for a long time. And I would always hook up with her boyfriend's friends. And it was kind of like a built-in, like, thing to our friendship. God. And there was this one guy who was a friend of her boyfriend at the time. And he was actually dating a girl I went to high school with. So she and I we had lost touch because it was years after high school, but I knew her, and we were on the cheerleading team together, and I liked her. And I knew that they had been dating for a few years. You would think that I would care, that I would be like, he's kind of off limits because it's, this girl's boyfriend. And I didn't care. And that was always kind of a rule of mine. Because you know how we make up these rules in drinking, like, well, I'm not going to drink on weekdays. I'm not going to drink hard alcohol. I had those rules with that too. It was like I would never go after somebody who was married or in a relationship. And I sure as shit would not go after somebody in a relationship with someone I knew. So there I was, with this opportunity, and we were in his car hooking up, and I wanted to have sex and he didn't want to. Like, he was drawing the line there. Cause like, here he is cheating on his girlfriend, a girl that I knew. And he was holding steadfast, and he was like, no, and I remember I finally climbed off of him in the car, grabbed my shoes, and got out of the car and slammed the door. I was so pissed off. And it really wasn't about the sex. It was the fact that he had said no to me. And I was embarrassed, and I was ashamed of, it's like I was being rejected. I was literally being rejected, and that had never happened to me before. And I'm like, how dare you? How dare you say no to me? And I remember walking away from that. I will never forget that parking lot of that apartment complex. Like, I remember just feeling, and it really, I know at that moment, it went beyond. I knew I was less mad at him for saying no and more mad at myself for even being in that situation, for betraying my own relationship, or betraying myself, for betraying this girl that I genuinely liked as a person. It was her boyfriend, and they'd been together for years. Of course, he, was a choice to hook up with me or not, but still, I felt like such a piece of shit human being in that moment. And if I blamed it on him, he's the one who made me feel bad, but really I was the one that was making me feel bad. So it's like, I remember all of these sort of holes that started to happen in my life, and where it started leaking, you know what I mean? And then it was years later, honestly, Sasha, it was years later where the whole dam broke, where I finally was like, this can't continue anymore. And this is pretty bad. But I think a lot of us have those small moments where the holes are happening, whether it's drinking or whether it's another addiction.
Oh, for sure. First of all, I have so many stories like that where the self-loathing was strong in me that I could but maybe I didn't stop right away, you know, but all of those experiences added up. And I've learned now today, as much as, you know, sometimes I don't think about it all the time at all. But when times like today where we're going back to the past and remembering things, there's still that feeling of like, oh, but then there's also for me that feeling of like, compassion because, you know, you were just trying to get your needs met and I was too. And we didn't know another way at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And I do. And I've actually written letters, you know, speaking of the solution, I've written letters to myself. I thought about actually reaching out to that girl. She and I are friends on Facebook and they're not together. They did not end up getting married. She married somebody else and has 2 kids. But I just don't think it would be helpful for her to know that. She might know, but I think it would just not be a good idea. But I've written a letter to myself saying that I'm sorry for everything. And for, you know, just like you were saying, just having compassion for that person because I was doing the best that I could and it was not great, but I didn't have any other tools. And that's, you know, where we are today. So you mentioned the one tool about connection and then self-compassion. And then another add on to that for anyone that feels like doing it is write a letter to yourself, write a letter. Even, you know, I could even write a letter to that girl and never send it, just a letter of apology about it and things like that. So what are like some non-negotiables in your sobriety toolkit today?
First of all, I would totally recommend writing a letter and not sending it just to get it out of, I do that and I've done that and it's like a form of journaling, right? But just to get it out of my head. And I also I have a little God box where I put stuff in there that I don't want to keep. And because one of the things that kept me really sick was that I never expressed myself. Like, I never said how I really felt. This isn't the case for everyone, of course, but for me, it was like I was so repressed that it was coming out in all these sideways, right? And so to be able to say how I feel, and even if I don't let that person know directly, but just being honest about it on paper is like extremely cathartic. I've been doing it a lot lately with just relationships where I'm not necessarily in contact with the person. But I would say my top 3 non-negotiables are really, really simple. I like to keep things simple. And of course I have like a whole toolbox of tools, and depending on the person, you know, you customize the tools that you want and the ones that work for you. But my top 3 non-negotiables are sleep. And by that, I mean like getting as close to 8 hours as I can every night. And I know that's hard for a lot of people, but for me, it's a non-negotiable. And I make sure that I go to bed and I don't stay up late especially when I don't have to, like when I have the choice and I'm, you know, I don't scroll Instagram and Facebook after like 8:30 at night.
Because there's nothing that you're going to miss that's going to change your life. Like,
no. It's the joy of missing out, not the fear of missing out.
I like that.
So the second, I would say yoga. Yoga's really helped me heal my physical body and reclaim my connection to my body, especially with all the eating disorders and all the sexual shame and all the body image distortion that I've had. It really has been instrumental. It's like medicine. And then I would say food. And by that, I mean making sure that I eat 3 meals a day and I have my food and I have sort of a meal plan, and I'm not on like a diet, but just making sure that I get proper nutrition so that, because I can get hangry so quickly that it's not funny. So I make it a priority because I know a lot of, especially as I'm in this different place in my life where it'd be really easy for me to get addicted to work and busyness and accomplishing things. And in that vein, it's really easy to forget to eat or skip a meal. And I make sure that I know as soon as I do that, because it starts to really impact my mood. And I act like a toddler, honestly. So I can't really get away with it. So those are my top 3 that are pretty basic and practical.
Yeah. I love that. I totally agree with all of those. And I think it's a great place, not just for all the time, not just a great place to start, but a great place to just like maintain your recovery too, and try to find some kind of balance there that works. I know that's kind of a tricky word, but that I'm so grateful to have you on, and thank you so much for this conversation, and just thanks for being on.
Thank you so much. The feeling is mutual, and I really enjoyed talking to you. It felt like just talking to a girlfriend and swapping war stories.
Right. War and recovery stories.
And solution and the triumph, right?
Yeah. I know I'm trying to do that in these episodes, is not just make it like let's talk about all the drama. Cause I mean, seriously, I could have like 16 series on the stories of things that I did where I'm just like, holy crap. But they're interesting to listen to. I know that. But everyone, if you go over to the show notes, the link to Sasha's website is there if you want to learn more about her, and also the link to the other podcast that we did on love addiction is there, and also the link to Pia Melody's book is there as well. I think it's a great resource to get started if you have just heard, if this is like the first time you've heard about love addiction or heard people talk about what it actually is, and that's all over there for you in the show notes. And until next time, ass kickers, I will see you all out in cyberspace. Bye-bye. Hey, ass kickers, you know what would help me out so much if you left a rating and review for this podcast. Your Kick-Ass Life podcast will always be free to you, and to help me get more awesome guests and to spread the word, it helps tremendously if you leave a rating and a review. Now, they don't particularly make this super easy to do, so I'll help you out a little. If you're in iTunes and you're on your phone, when you are in the podcast app, you need to search for Your Kick-Ass Life podcast. I know, even if you're subscribed, this is how you do it. So when you search for it and you see it come up, click on the cover art, then towards the top where it says reviews, click that, scroll down a tiny little bit, and then click write a review. Stitcher is a bit easier if you're on Android. The easiest way I found to do this is to type into Google, Stitcher.com, Your Kick-Ass Life, and voila, my podcast should pop up as the first link. Scroll down and click write a review. That's it. Thank you so very much. You have no idea how much it helps me when you do that. All right. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.